session will be Universally Composable Almost Everywhere Secure Computation by Nishanth, Chandran, Pouyan Forghani, Juan, Garay, Rafail, Ostrovsky, Rutvik, Patel, and Vassilis, Zikas. And Pouyan will be giving it.
Yeah, hi, I'm Pouyan. So I'm this one. Yeah, sure. Okay. Guys, hi, I'm Pouyan, and today I'm presenting our recent work on universally composable almost everywhere secure computation. This is a joint work, as mentioned earlier, but Rutvik Patel is also here with us today that I'm presenting. Okay, we first start with a definition of regular standard MPC, where we have n distrusting participant, all with an input, and they want to correctly compute a joint function of their input without revealing anything beyond the output to the adversary, who's probably corrupting up to the threshold of the participant. But as we know, most of the work on MPC assumes a fully connected network, but obviously it's not quite well scalable. So it's natural to investigate like a sparse communication graph for like running different computation. But there are some challenges associated with sparse graph. For example, on this very simple, not complete network, if you assume that these two red nodes are corrupted and these two green nodes are honest, you can see that for the green node, a majority of neighbors are corrupted, so they can manipulate the majority of the view of the portable that this gray node can see. So they can potentially cause a reduction in the security guarantees that we can offer to that honest node. So we call that node doomed because he or she probably cannot enjoy the full security of the protocol that's intended. But the remaining honest parties that we color them in green, we call them privileged because they can enjoy the full security of the protocol. Giving up on some honest nodes in sparse graph is unavoidable. Like in extreme case, the adversary can corrupt all the neighbors of a node and like leave the node out of the computation completely. And for example, in Byzantine agreement, in which we have like n participant, each with a different input, potentially different input, and we want to guarantee two properties. First, agreement, meaning that all honest party output the same value at the end, and validity, meaning that if all honest parties start with the same value v, they all output the exact value v at the end. But Dolev showed that to achieve these two properties among all honest parties, we need a connectivity of at least order degree t. So meaning that sparse graphs doesn't allow us to achieve these two properties among all honest parties. So what is the meaningful security guarantee that we can get on a sparse network? To answer that question, the work all proposed almost everywhere security notion, and they define this AE agreement, which is essentially the same as Byzantine agreement, but those two properties are now only provided for a subset of honest parties instead of all of them. We call that subset privileged parties. They also provided a protocol for that, and the idea was to kind of simulate reliable point-to-point channels first, and then run a Byzantine agreement on top. And for that, they specified a set of paths between sender and receiver. And then to send the message, the sender sends it over all the path, and at the receiver, they take a simple majority of the received value to generate the output. And obviously, since this path contains parties which can be corrupted, so we cannot rely on all of them. And as a result, this scheme leads to an almost everywhere reliable message transmission, or AE RMT for short. Building on that, Garay and Ostrovsky extended the AE notion to MPC, which is like regular MPC, but again, the guarantees are only provided to a subset of honest parties. They also have a protocol achieving AE MPC. They follow the same idea. They simulated point-to-point channels first, and then they ran like a regular MPC on that. But here they needed secure channel instead of reliable channel. So they introduced like this secure message transmission by public discussion, or SMTPD for short, in which they assume a public channel in addition to all the paths between sender and receiver. And they showed that using this public channel, it's only sufficient to have a single honest path to establish SMT. And since they didn't want to assume a public channel, they replaced it with AE broadcast, which is achievable from AE RMT, which we saw that Dvork et al. Showed how to get it from AE RMT. And here's a table to compare the classical results on AE RMT constructions. The first one is the work of Dvork et al. That has a constant degree graph, but it cannot tolerate a linear number of corruptions, which is not like satisfactory, not desired. So all the follow-up works consider the linear number of corruptions, but none of them can keep the degree constant except for upfall that has exponential running time. It's still open if we can have a efficient construction that get the same bounds as upfall, optimal bounds as upfall. And here I want to emphasize that the goal is to minimize the degree and maximize the number of corruption that we can tolerate, and also minimize the number of doomed parties. If we combine these AE RMT constructions with Garay and Ostrovsky result, we can get AE MPC with essentially the same bounds. But all of these frameworks considered property-based security. We give universally composable treatment of the problem. We specifically use Kennety's UC language, but our arguments should be like valid in other mainstream composable security framework. It's important to have a treatment in a composable framework because it provides us with modular security proof and universal composition. And this way we had some challenges, for example, unifying all the different models in the literature, and more importantly, simulating doomed parties, because as we said, doomed parties may experience some reduced level of security, which means that simulator needs some extra control over them, but we cannot simply crop those parties to provide that control to the simulator, because they are actually honest and they might be able to generate output, but if they are cropped, they cannot do that. So we'll see how we figure out these challenges in the rest of the talk. But before going over our results, let's look at our model. We considered unconditional security because assuming a PKI, this problem would be trivial. We have signatures and we can simply do whatever we want. And also this unconditional security fits better with the SMT literature and also this conference. We assume adaptive adversary who can crop parties on the go during the execution of the protocol. And we assume a synchronous network, meaning that communication proceeds in rounds and messages sent in one round or delivered in the beginning of the next round. And the network topology, we enforce it with restricted secure channel functionality. We parameterize this secure channel functionality to make sure that we have only secure channel between specific pairs of nodes. Okay, so now that we see the introduction, we can talk about like a simple warm-up scenario in which we considered a classical RMT and SMT problem in a simple wire model introducced by Golub et al. We have a dedicated sender and receiver and a number of corruptible wires connecting them. To model these corruptible wires in UC, we introduced dummy parties, called them wire party. They're connecting sender to the receiver, and they're playing the role of wires by just simply relaying the messages. But now that they are parties, we can crop them. So using this model, we proved that the very simple protocol of sending the message over all the wires and taking the majority of the receiver realizes fauth, which is essentially authenticated channel, against an adversary corrupting up to a minority of wire parties. We also proved that the protocol in DDWY, if adapted to UC, can realize FSMT, which is essentially secure channel functionality, again, against an adversary corrupting up to a minority of wire parties. Now, a question is that can we get statement independent of the number of corruptions? And that question is closely related to the notion of AE security, because if a majority of wires between sender and receiver are corrupted, then we cannot provide any guarantee to the sender and receiver, even though they're honest. So they become doomed. So to answer this question, we first should find a way to relate sets of corruptions to set of doomed parties. And for that, we introduced a relation, a D, and call it doom structure, which is a collection of pairs relating set of corruptions, TI, to a possible set of doom party, DI. Okay, as we said, parties become doom in the real world naturally, like because of the topology and the protocol we are using. But in the ideal world, we should find a way to somehow enforce this doom structure. And for that, we get help from wrapper functionalities. Here, if you consider this functionality F that has interaction with dummy parties and the simulator, a wrapper functionality comes around this functionality F and basically relaying all the communication with dummy parties, but doing some sort of processing on the communication with simulator based on the doom structure. And that's the place we're enforcing the doom structure, basically. Using the wrapper, if we define a doom structure such that when a majority of wire parties are corrupted, then doom one of the sender or receiver or both of them, we can rewrite our statement without having any dependency on the number of corruptions. But of course, we are realizing here the wrapped version of those two functionalities instead of purely them. Okay, so now we can go over a more complicated and more involved scenario that we consider AE RMT and AE SMT, but this time over sparse graphs, not the simple model. We first start with AE RMT. And interestingly, we show that using the very same wrapper, here we can model classical AE RMT construction in UC. But for that, we needed to define appropriate doom structures for corresponding AE security guarantees that offered in the AE classical AE RMT constructions like DPPU, OPPOL, CG, and JRV, basically all those schemes that we saw in the table. We did that by going over their transmission schemes, and using those doom structures, we proved a UC security of all those classical AE RMT constructions. Here we have two separate theorems because, as we said, DPPU has different tolerance for number of corruptions, so we separated it out. And here we preserve all the bounds from the classical results, and number of doomed parties here now is encoded inside the doom structure. Okay, this was AE RMT, but we are also interested in AE SMT because we want to, at the end, we want to realize MPC, and for that we needed secure channels. For AESMT, we have two approaches. The first one is using a perfect SMT protocol from DDWY, which is relatively simple. The sender chooses the key and secretures that key and send each over a path. And once the key is established, the sender can encrypt the message and send the encryption over all the paths, and the receiver can take a majority to find out the message. If you apply this technique over the set of paths provided by DPPU transmission scheme, by using the same doom structure, we can get perfect AESMT over DPPU graph, which is nice because we preserve all the bounds, but we improve the guarantee to have security as well. But as it may be evident, here we need a majority of honest path between every pair of privileged nodes, and that's only guaranteed by DPPU transmission scheme. So, so what about others like opfault? For those, we follow another approach, SMTPD from Garay and Ostrovsky. As we said, we assume the additional public channel in addition to all the paths that we have. And as we said, using this public channel, it's sufficient to have only a single honest wire between sender and receiver to establish secure channel. And again, here we replace this public channel with wrapped off that we just realized. Then we can show that using the same doom structures, we get a statistical AESMT over opfault, CGU, and JRB. Again, by preserving all the classical bounds for AERMT. Okay. In the next section, we prove composability of our AE security, and as a simple corollary, we give the first AE UC secure AE MPC. This is a graphical representation of our composition theorem. Basically states that given a protocol pi using hybrids F1, F2 to Fm that realizes a wrapped functionality F with a doom structure D, the compiled protocol pi, which is essentially the same as pi, compiled protocol C of pi, which is essentially pi with one difference being that all the hybrids are replaced with the wrapped version, each with a different doom structure, D1 to DM. The composition theorem states that this compiled protocol also serializes the same wrapped version of the same functionality, but with a new doom structure D prime. And in our formal statement, we concretely specify this D prime based on D1, D2 to DM and D. But in order to apply our composition theorem, we need all these doom structures to has a to satisfy a property, AE monotonicity, which informally means that we want doom structure satisfy this property that by corrupting more parties, all the previously doomed parties remain doomed, which is kind of natural, but we needed it for the proof, so we formally defined it. And here we like to emphasize that if all those doom structures D1 to DM and D are AE monotone, the new doom structure D prime is also AE monotone. And this is important because if we want to reuse our composition theorem again on the composed protocol, we needed this, and so this is nice. Okay, to give a high-level idea of our proof, in the proof, we constructed a simulator S prime that uses the given simulator for the protocol pi S as a subroutine. And this S prime also does some processing over communications of this S with other entities. for example, all the Doom requests issued by the environment that are targeted to wrapped hybrids are now replaced with corruption requests targeted to the unwrapped hybrids. We're doing this to make all these messages understandable by this internal simulator. And also, all the reports sent by S to the environment that are coming from unwrapped hybrids now are replaced in the way that they're coming from the wrapped hybrid, because we don't like the environment can distinguish within these two scenarios. And all the corruption, among all the corruptions requests issued by the simulator, only those that are actually requested by the environment going without change to the wrapped functionality, and all the rest are transformed to Doom requests because we want to be compatible with the wrapped functionality. And all the other communications remain unchanged. And we can show that using this simulator, we can carry out the reduction successfully. And yeah, that's basically it. Okay, now using our composition theorem and our results on UC secure AE SMT, and choosing basically any information theoretic adaptively secure adaptively UC secure MPC, we can give the first a UC secure AE MPC, of course, with perfect security over DPPU and statistical security over all pods CGU and JRB, and again by preserving all the classical bounds. And now those bounds are encoded inside the Doom structures. So now we can conclude. So we give the first simulation-based treatment of AE MPC, and we are interested to investigate properties of Doom structure more, potentially categorize them as realizable and unrealizable, if we can, or any other category that we may think of. And the other important open problem is that can we come up with a efficient construction that allows for AE MPC over the constant degree graph with optimal bounds tolerating a linear number of corruptions and dooming a linear dooming a linear number of parties. We don't know the answer to this question even in the property-based setting. And thank you for your attention. You can find our full version on the ePrint, and I would be happy to take any question. Okay.